Hello, everyone, and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again to keep on making yourselves availed to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features on YouTube. You guys have been doing an excellent job at that. Continue making this show as interactive as possible. I want to hear all your opinions, your analyses, your questions, your comments, your concerns to make this show better, and everything you do for it is greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of today's show and transition from wide receivers to tight ends in terms of fantasy rankings and where they stand after a week of NFL action. Now, with tight ends, a lot of controversy surrounding. A lot of different ways you can look at this position group, like I said, leading up to the NFL season and the fantasy football season as a whole. But these top five guys really represent how versatile the tight end market truly is, and how week by week each of these guys, no matter their age, no matter their team, can really step up and be the TE1 week in, week out. So without further ado, let's look into them. Starting off at number 5, a guy who kind of had a disappointing game through no fault of his own, because it really was Jordan Mason's game to shine. But George Kittle, I don't think he'll always be this disappointing. It's just that, Kyle Shanahan can be so varied in his game plans, much like a Ben Johnson. And I think that in all of the NFC, those two teams have so many different ways to beat you. They're the only two teams where I know they can either have a very run-dominant game plan or pass-happy game plan, and they can find ways to win. So it's just the lay of the land here. It's just a week-by-week thing. But George Kittle will still have a lot of targets in this offense. 4 catches on his 5 targets, 40 yards, 8 fantasy points. And not necessarily the worst of days for George Kittle. It's just that, the San Francisco 49ers, at the end of the day, had the most mouths to feed out of anyone in the NFL on the offensive side of the ball. And it's what you do with them, yes. But George Kittle can take up so many different roles in this offense. He can block, he can catch, he can do so many things. He's potent in the red zone, he's potent in the open field. So this time will come, and he deserves a place in the top 5 fantasy tight ends, potentially week in, week out. But again, it's the 49ers. Any given week, they could have any given game plan, and they'll be fine with it. And we just have to live with the results. As thank you for the tip, Meryl Shepard. Thank you for the tip, Mom. So, again, George Kittle, week in, week out, will prove that he deserves the spot, at least in the top 5 tight ends. But number 4, a little bit more youth, like I said. It's the youth movement against the old heads. And Dalton Kincaid will lead that movement, but this weekend was not his week for sure. Only 1 catch on 11 yards, 2.1 fantasy points. So as you can see, not the best of starts to his sophomore season in the NFL. But I think that game against Arizona really came down to Josh Allen saying, okay, I'll do it all myself, and I will lead this team to the promised land. And the way he did it was that, yes, he could have had more targets for Dalton Kincaid. He could have spread the ball around a little bit more. But he understood that anyone at any given time will be able to step up. He had touchdown passes to Mac Hollins and Khalil Shakir. So think about that. Think about how Josh Allen will now want to view this offense, and think about how it could affect a guy like Dalton Kincaid. Because Dalton Kincaid was technically, quote-unquote, even though he's not a wide receiver, the wide receiver 2 in that offense last year, if you really think about it. He was someone who really had a lot of targets and a lot of volume and depth of those targets as a result. So, on a week-by-week basis, I think that Dalton Kincaid will be very volatile in where he stands in people's minds, but he's still a fascinating tight end, especially in a team that could use him in certain situations more often than not. So look out for Dalton Kincaid's stats to only go up from here. This game is not an indictment of him, and much like Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's still an important facet to his offense as well. But at number 3, this is a guy who will always be a surprisingly quiet game, but I kind of expected it, seeing as to how the Kansas City Chiefs are also one of those teams that can spread the ball around and not necessarily matter who catches it. Travis Kelce. 3 catches, 34 yards, 6.4 fantasy points. So, as you can see, as Quinn Lenardi, a trade, I love this, or a decision to make for his fantasy team rather. T. Higgins or Amari Cooper rest of the season. This is a weird one, isn't it? Because both of these guys are 2 guys who, in many different ways, can start to decline this season. And what I mean by that is they can start to have certain issues potentially off the field start to seep into their on-the-field play. Let's start with T. Higgins, because T. Higgins is definitely a weird situation. He had the injury right in this past game, and he also has the whole contract. Well, not necessarily a contract dispute, but worries over the future and what his contract in the future will look like, whether he's or not he's a Cincinnati Bengal, because he's only on the franchise tag this year. Let's be clear. And then Amari Cooper, my concern with him is not just, age, but will this offense even ever get going? So when you look at it that way, it's mainly about, whether or not you think that T. Higgins, when he gets back, will be focused on getting more targets in this offense, or will he let what happened in the offseason linger? And even though Jamar Chase has that same worry, I still think that this offense is a huge opportunity for T. Higgins in it. Whereas Amari Cooper, I don't really trust this offense to really get going that often. Even if during the middle of the season, Deshaun Watson either magically becomes who he was in Texas, Houston, or Jameis Winston somehow gets the starting job in the middle of the season, I don't see how Amari Cooper is an appealing fantasy option anymore. And to top it all off, he's getting up there in age. I believe he's 32 years old. So you have to consider that. As tap to learn, I don't know what exactly this means, but Deshaun isn't. I believe you're alluding to potentially Deshaun isn't going anywhere, perhaps, but it has to be considered at some point. The guy isn't necessarily, or Deshaun isn't magically doing anything, and I agree with that sentiment. So I think that T. Higgins is the quote-unquote safer option, but I still don't feel good about either of those guys. But if that's the decision for you, then be that as it may. And it is what it is, because neither of these guys right now are in appealing situations for their futures. But T. Higgins just seems quote-unquote better off, in my humble opinion. But that was a fantastic question. Keep them coming. Very interesting comment. Let's get back to the tight ends and Travis Kelce, because he is someone who will potentially pretend to be quieter in this offense, but he still is someone who Patrick Mahomes knows he can rely upon. He still is someone who Patrick Mahomes, in the back of his mind, knows is one of his favorite targets. They've had the most experience in this offense together. And while Rashee Rice looked like a wide receiver 1 this past week, and while Xavier Worthy, with the limited touches he had, made the most of them, and while Marquise Hollywood-Brown hasn't even played, Travis Kelce is the biggest X factor in this offense. If all of those guys are somehow quiet and they're being held for next to nothing, that Travis Kelce can really open things up under the middle and do his magic. But that's something to be considered. And number 2, another guy who kind of had a disappointing start to his season, also in the younger kind of sect of tight ends, but Trey McBride. How to make sense of him? He had 5 catches, 30 yards, 8 fantasy points. Now this is a guy who a lot of people are expecting to be one of the focal points of the Cardinals offense, but he really wasn't. And what shocked me was that even though I was impressed by the Cardinals' red zone offense and the many different ways that Kyler went about trying to get the ball to some weapons like Michael Wilson, handing it off to James Conner, who's fantastic at the goal line in those situations. Trey McBride, I don't necessarily know if it's, trying to get him open, trying too hard to get him open, or in the back of his mind, Kyler not wanting to disappoint people in terms of Marvin Harrison Jr., but there seems to be a disconnect between what Trey McBride can do and how the Cardinals are going about doing it. Because yes, there are many different ways that this offense can improve, and there are many different players who can improve in this offense because of Kyler Murray's presence. But at the end of the day, Trey McBride is someone who I kind of feel fell flat, but can improve still. Don't let this be kind of a knock on him just because in a game where Kyler Murray was fully healthy, he did not get as many targets as you expected. And against the Rams, expect for him to have a better game. I think that he'll find it easier against the Rams secondary to get open a little bit more often, and he can be a security blanket in that game for Kyler Murray. But number one, Sam Laporta. Let's talk about him because there's a lot of contentious talk about a guy like Sam Laporta becoming the new tight end one. He also, much like Amon-Ra St. Brown, did not have an impressive game here. 4 catches, 5 targets, 45 yards, 8.5 fantasy points. And he's someone who I was talking about as being a tight end one, but not having the best of tight end one seasons. And I feel like that could be the case again this year. He's not someone who's going to get pretty numbers. He wins ugly. He's a part of the ugly nature of how the Detroit Lions construct their offense. And so Sam Laporta will do whatever is necessary to help this Lions offense, but he's not necessarily going to do it to the point where you're completely excited. As Andre says, I got Likely off waivers and Kelsey's my starter. I like that tight end room for you, Andre, in fantasy purposes. I think Likely will get a lot of targets in this offense. I don't know what Mark Andrews was, as saw Laporta blocking a lot. Yeah, that's another big concern because Laporta can become more of a blocking tight end. Although they don't necessarily need it up front, I think the Lions' O-line is fine without him. But it is something to take note of. But the tight end room they're talking about, as Andre has another question. Keep them coming, man. Question, would you trade Kelsey for McBride straight up? Ooh, that's a rough one. Because I think I still have hope for McBride in this Cardinals offense. I still think McBride is someone who can be very potent in the red zone for them. And that game was not indicative of what I think Trey McBride can be in this Cardinals offense should they get more red zone trips in the future. Travis Kelce, there is concern about him. There is concern about what he will look like in this offense. But at the end of the day, I still think Travis Kelce will have more high upside later in the year, whereas Trey McBride is kind of a cohesion thing, where you kind of have to work your way up to solid week-by-week Trey McBride performances in fantasy. Whereas Travis Kelce, I have more faith in producing bigger stat lines more often, so to speak. So I wouldn't necessarily trade Kelce for McBride straight up. But to your point about your tight end room, I like this tight end room as well. Likely as insurance, Kelce as your starter, you're all set. But overall, getting back to this overarching sentiment of this list, I like this list, but I think that it just goes to show that so many different tight ends are in different offenses. They have different situations to worry about in their offenses. On any given week, I feel like this could change in pundits' minds, in my minds. And before we go to the break, I will address another question that Andre left for me. If I were to trade Kelce for McBride, ask for another player with him, I think you could, because Travis Kelce still holds a lot of weight in fantasy leagues, but it also depends on what position you're looking for. Because if you're looking for a wide receiver, I could see it make a lot of sense, but if you're not necessarily looking for a position of note, or player of note for that matter, then I would be kind of hesitant about this trade. With that being said, if you are willing to look at his team and say, someone here outside of Trey McBride can also help me, then I think it would be an interesting trade. But we do have to take a quick break. Continue with the comments, though, guys. They have been incredible. But we'll take a quick break. And when we return, we talk about our updated Heisman odds. I promise I will get to your comment, Andre, right after this quick break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without